Salve Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve Radix, Salve Porta, ex qua mundo lux extorta, Gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnes.
This evening I've got the honor of presenting E.J. Dionne, former student of mine, former House President of St. Denis years ago. And before I get to the introduction of speaking this evening, which is given in the program, I'd like to give you a brief background of his career while he was at Portsmouth. He, of course, needs no introduction. Those of us who are used to seeing intellectual programs on television or reading intellectual magazines will have no need of any kind of an introduction at all. But you may not know what his credentials are from Portsmouth, what Portsmouth's contribution it was to his career. First of all, I'd like to give you an anecdote concerning him, which some of you may have already heard, but it's especially appropriate on this occasion. At a headmaster's meeting, when Mr. John Wilkinson was headmaster of Portsmouth, several headmasters were talking to John about the paucity of good writers then being published. These were people like Christopher Ogden, Christopher Buckley, and E.J. Dionne. Each of these had written a bestseller, which at the same time was critically acclaimed. The first, biography by Chris Ogden. The second, a satirical novel, Chris Buckley. And the third, receptive analysis of American politics by our own E.J. Dionne. One of the headmasters noticed John Wilkinson, who had spent a number of years as secretary of the president at Yale University, with a smile on his face. And he observed, "I see why you are smiling. Two of these writers are from Yale, and only one from Harvard." "No," said John, smiling, "because they are all from Portsmouth Abbey." When E.J. was a student at Portsmouth, he laid the foundations of what has since become his career, namely a political analyst, a journalist, commentator on current affairs, with appearances in lecture halls and on television. I once happened to be watching a C-SPAN program and was agreeably surprised to find both E.J. and Chris Buckley as the guests on this program. What impressed me most was their civilized, perhaps Miss Benedictine behavior, even though they held opposed political views. When he was a student here, E.J. and a classmate started a political journal called The Phoenix, a magazine which subsequently, like what the bird, the phoenix, actually means a bird which every 1,000 years goes to a place in Egypt, is incinerated, and then rises from the ashes. That magazine did subsequently arise again after he had long since graduated, when there were presidential elections by his succeeding students here. Well, since it was an election year, he started this magazine with another fellow student, and the publication stimulated the whole student body to take an active, enthusiastic interest in national politics. Some of the boys, an all-male school then, learned for the first time that there was more than one political party. He did for Portsmouth in the field of current events what Bill Buckley did at Yale when he was chairman of the Yale Daily News, which was the most influential position on the campus. Before Buckley took over, no one ever thought of reading the editorials. This changed immediately, with everyone curious as to what Buckley was had to say each day. Not very often approving, but still reading him with grudging admiration and intense interest. His approach was always conservative, but he often allowed his Catholic background to service when he felt it was appropriate. Here, E.J. did not have to assert his religious views, but he was able to make everyone, including faculty, more aware of the political scene. He was also an informed debater and was part of a group of 4 extremely knowledgeable and articulate sixth formers who were chosen to represent the school on a series of television quiz shows for Rhode Island high schools. Needless to say, Portsmouth was the winner in the competition, or else I wouldn't even mention it. This also gave E.J. a valuable experience of performing in front of the camera and speaking extemporaneously. Besides being, now I'll return to the text, besides being a columnist for the Washington Post, he's also a senior fellow in government studies at the Brookings Institution, a university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown Public Policy Institute, a senior research fellow at St. Anselm's College. I wonder if that's the one in New Hampshire?
It's where I graduated of Portsmouth.
Oh, yes. Very good. Yes. And an NPR commentator. His published works include the influential 1991 bestseller, Why Americans Hate Politics, and I love the titles of his books. They Only Look Dead, Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era in 1996, and, this is the best, Stand Up, Fight Back, Republican Toughs, Democratic Wimps, and Politics of Revenge in 2004. Dionne holds a BA from Harvard University in 1973, where he's elected to Phi Beta Kappa, and, not insignificantly, he was selected Cause to Cum Laude Honor Society here at Portsmouth. And he also is a doctor of philosophy in 1982 from Balliol College, the best college at Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Dionne was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and raised in Fall River, Massachusetts. He lives in Bethesda, Maryland, with his wife and 3 children. So it's my great pleasure and honor to present E.J. Dionne now.
Wow. That was such a wonderful introduction. I'm so happy you mentioned the Phoenix, because just so you know that I was the right-wing editor, my friend was the left-wing editor, and we are now both apostates. So, that was so much nicer. I got an introduction recently when I was going to talk about politics that ended, and now for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. So Father Daniel, thank you so much. It is a joy to be back at Portsmouth, and a special joy to be secure in the knowledge that at the end of this talk, I will not have to face a grade and potentially an acerbic comment worthy of William F. Buckley Jr. himself from Father Damien with that trademark scrawl, DK scrawl of his that all of his former students remember. I am in the company of hundreds and hundreds who can say that Father Damien taught us how to write. Although I would never claim that my writing has ever lived up to his standards. I always edit myself furiously, knowing that a sentence can always be better than it is, that a different word might be better than the one I used, that a metaphor might be overwrought, and I always try to catch that dangling participle before it crashes to the ground, and I have just used a metaphor that I'm sure Father Damien would tell me I should have cut out of this speech. Father Damien produced something very rare. It is the literary version of Catholic guilt. So thank you very, very much. In fact, I would love to know how Father Damien would have graded Bill Buckley. One can imagine his taking Buckley to task for using polysyllabic or multisyllabic, which is it, words when a simple word would do, and repeating the observation of a writer who once said of Buckley, he used so many outsized words that you would have thought that he was doing research for a spelling bee. Then again, Father Damien might have softened, as this same writer did, and add, in his whole public career, Mr. Buckley never dumbed down a single sentence or spent 3 seconds pandering to an audience. Excuse me. 3 seconds pandering to an audience. I want to pander just a little bit. I want to pay tribute to all the monks and brothers and teachers that I had at Portsmouth Abbey. I want to say special thanks to the abbot who did all he could to teach me Latin when he was Mr. Holmes, and my Latin never approached that of Mr. Buckley's, but it wasn't because it wasn't for lack of effort on the part of the abbot. We are grateful that this wise and humble man of spirit has assumed leadership of the monastery, filling the very large shoes. I mean that in a sense of spirit and intellectual gifts once worn by Father Matthew, but it's great to be here with you. And I have said many times to friends that the actions and attitudes of the Benedictines here were at least as important in shaping my own faith as their often brilliant words. As we learned this afternoon, Gregorian chant helped also. Because of them, I have always rejected the counsel of those who claim that religious believers were ignorant or blind or culturally backward or intellectually unsophisticated. Here were some of the most intelligent and sophisticated people I would ever encounter, who could speak of faith and culture and literature and politics with clarity, erudition, and elegance. Time will tell whether they helped save my immortal soul, but they certainly saved me from a sometimes popular and always foolish prejudice against men and women of faith. So I thank you all very, very much. It's very clear from the program that the organizers of this event are indeed part of the vast right-wing conspiracy. Some of them actually are some of my favorite members of the vast right-wing conspiracy. Senator Buckley in front of us was always one of the most decent men, is one of the most decent men to have ever served in the United States Senate. And when I saw him today, I got a memory of his debate with Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the 1976 election. And I'll never forget the moment when Senator Buckley turned to Moynihan and referred to him as Professor Moynihan. And then not yet Senator Moynihan looked at Mr. Buckley and said, "Ah, now the mudslinging begins." But the organizers of this event have engaged in a clever trick in inviting me here. They clearly have the same definition of the words fair and balanced as do the people at Fox News. They loaded up their program with one smart conservative after another, and then they invited me, a self-confessed liberal, to give the dinner speech tonight. That would be a modest, if not necessarily fair, form of balance. But of course, they also knew that I was a fan and friend of Chris Buckley's, whom I was lucky enough to attend this school with. And they also knew that I am indeed soft on William F. Buckley, Jr. I may be the only liberal columnist who not only read every single Blackford Oaks novel, but bought all of them in hardcover. Right there on the record are my prejudices in this matter. I wrote a column 4 years ago that began with the words, "It is time that I confess to an illicit love. I am now and have been almost all my life an admirer of William F. Buckley, Jr." In that same column, written in the first year of George W. Bush's second term, I also said, "My main criticism of Buckley is that he was far too effective on behalf of a movement that I think should be driven from power." And if you heard that as a compliment to Buckley, you were right. I think it's very hard, no matter your politics, not to be soft on Bill Buckley. Now, the skeptical conservative might say it's easy for liberals to have loved this elitist Yale grad who used big words, hung out with the likes of John Kenneth Galbraith, and led a rather glamorous life. Now, I'll admit to admiring Buckley's love of life, to enjoying those novels, to sharing his respect for Galbraith, but actually I'm not a fan of big words words, Yale grads, except for Father Damien, glamour or elitism. And it's not easy for any liberal to agree with Buckley on a number of issues. His support long ago for Joe McCarthy, though his novel about McCarthy was much better. It's hard to credit some of his early views on civil rights, which I'll return to, and I disagreed with him on a number of other subjects. But what a marvelous man, and what a marvelous life he led. For his one-liners alone, we should honor him. For his sense of humor, we should revere him. For his zest and energy, we should envy him. As Gary Wills writes in his lovely memorial to him in the Current Atlantic, hour by hour, day by day, Bill Buckley was just an exciting person to be around. Let's begin by laughing with Buckley. Here I would offer just a small collection of his zingers, including a few of his pithy replies to some of the many letters he got when as editor of National Review. Liberals, Buckley said, claim to want to give a hearing to other views, but then are shocked and offended to discover that there are other views. He also said, it had all the earmarks of a CIA operation. The bomb killed everybody in the room except the intended target. He observed, I say this as a professor, the academic community has it the biggest concentration of alarmists, cranks, and extremists this side of the Giggle House. One must bear in mind, he said, that the expansion of federal activity is a form of eating for politicians. And this certainly seems appropriate, at least to some of us, after a recent presidency. He said the more complicated and powerful the job, the more rudimentary the preparation for it. It's worth thinking about. And then there are those letters. A gentleman named Ron Kelly wrote Buckley a letter with a single sentence, "Your syntax is horrible," to which Buckley replied, "If you had my syntax, you'd be rich." A reader named Eric Beck wrote Buckley a very long letter complaining about his use of big words. Mr. Beck's letter contained nothing but big words, including a few invented ones, 2 sample sentences from Mr. Beck's letter. In promulgating your esoteric coagitations or in articulating your superficial sentimentalities of psychological observations, beware of platitudinous ponderosity. Sedulously avoid all polysyllabical profundity, pompous prolixity, and ventriloquial verbosity. Buckley took Mr. Beck's advice to heart. Here's what he wrote back. Me Bill, me no like 'em Beck. Bad Beck. William F. Buckley. In the early 1970s, a high school girl named Glenda Warren wrote Buckley with great deference. Dear Liege Lord, she wrote, help. I've fallen in love with the leader of the revolution in my high school. What do I do? Buckley's reply, spy on him for the FBI and send us copies. And I couldn't resist one last letter. Mr. Bill Howell from Clarksburg, West Virginia, wrote Buckley to say, this past week, my copy of National Review and Sports Illustrated's celebrated swimsuit issue arrived simultaneously in my mailbox. To my surprise, I found that I read NR cover to cover before examining the SI. Does this signal that my espousal of conservatism is now complete? Buckley wrote back, in part, yes, but it also signals that your espousal of other things is less than complete. Buckley himself espoused life whole, and he did not fear snap judgments. He welcomed them. Some of them were simply wrong, or at least they seemed so in light of subsequent events. Consider his early view of the Beatles. The Beatles are not merely awful, he said. They are so unbelievably horrible, so appallingly unmusical, so dogmatically insensitive sensitive to the magic of the art that they qualify as crowned heads of anti-music. Now, maybe in this good conservative crowd, there are many who agree with Bill Buckley's view of the Beatles. This meeting has rightly focused its attention on Buckley as a believer and as a Christian, and it is right and fitting that we do so. Buckley's faith was central to who he was and to everything he believed about everything else. I was baptized a Catholic, he wrote in his book, Nearer My God, and reared as one by devoted parents whose emotional and intellectual energies never cloyed. My faith has not wavered, though I permit myself to wonder whether, if it had, I'd advertise it. Would I encourage my dinner companions to know that I was blind in my left eye? I read that and wanted to ask him, did your faith ever waver? He wrote again, the church is unique in that it is governed by a vision that has not changed in 2,000 years. It tells us in just about as many words that we are not accidental biological accretions. We are creatures of a divine plan, that the God who made us undertook to demonstrate his devotion to us as individual human beings by submitting to the pain and humiliation of the cross. Nothing in that vision has ever changed, nothing at all. And this, for all Christians, is a mind-shaking, for some a mind-altering certitude with which Christians live in our earnest, if pitiable efforts to clear the way for a love that cannot be requited. And consider this poetic response by Buckley to the scientifically inclined who see accidents of nature where others see the hand of God. Skepticism about life and nature is most often expressed by those who take it for granted that belief is an indulgence of the superstitious, indeed their opiate, to quote a historical cosmologist most profoundly dead. Granted that to look up at the stars comes close to compelling disbelief, how can such a chance arrangement be other than an elaboration near infinite of natural impulses? Yes, but on the other hand, who is to say that the arrangement of the stars is more easily traceable to nature than to nature's molder? What is the greater miracle, the raising of the dead man in Lazarus, or the mere existence of the man who swore to his bride? But if Buckley's faith was central to him, his worldly mission was political, and boy did he do well at it. And here I'm treading on some ground that I think Lee Edwards talked about and has written a book about. How much would all of us wish to be as successful as this columnist, editor, novelist, lecturer, organizer, adventurer, television star, and one-time political candidate who said that his first act upon winning election would be to demand a recount? I would certainly be satisfied if I could just be 5% as effective on behalf of the ideas that I believe in as Bill Buckley was on behalf of his own political faith. Buckley undertook a mission and carried it out with great genius. He knew that conservatism needed a serious intellectual life if conservative ideas were to be considered by those outside the right's faithful remnant. That's why he founded National Review. He knew cranks were bad for the movement. He knew that deep splits among conservatives between internationalists and isolationists, libertarians and traditionalists had to be healed. Buckley felt no compunction about challenging liberal elites on their own ground. He fired plenty of shots at liberal dominance of academia, beginning with God and Man at Yale. In the process, he pioneered the most effective form of conservative jiu-jitsu, a movement devoted to the interests of the wealthy and the powerful, cast itself as a collection of populists challenging liberal snobbery. Buckley was determined to rid the right of wingnuts. He was, to his everlasting credit, the surge of an anti-Semitism that once had a significant hold on parts of the right. He also blasted the strange conspiracy theories of the John Birch Society. Gary Wills, again, had it right. By the time of his death, even Bill's earlier critics admitted that he had done much to make conservatism respectable by purging it of racist and fanatical traits earlier embedded in it. He distanced his followers from the Southern prejudices of George Wallace, the anti-Semitism of Liberty Lobby, the fanaticism of the John Birch Society, the glorification of selfishness by Ayn Rand, the paranoia and conspiratorialism of the neocons. In each of these cases, right-wingers tried to cut off donations from National Review, but Bill stood his ground. Wills concludes that in doing so, he elevated the discourse of American politics, making civil debate possible between responsible liberals and conservatives. Now, Buckley was vexed. Go ahead, cheer Bill Buckley or something. Buckley was vexed by conservatism's contradictions. He tried mightily to resolve them, and I believe his exertions made it possible for Barry Goldwater and then Ronald Reagan to turn the conservative movement into a mighty political force. Buckley once offered a very kind column about a book I had written, and I remain hugely grateful for that column, but it also occurred to me afterward that of course he might rather have liked a book that assigned him a much larger role in the rise of the right than it assigned to Ronald Reagan. But it is true that he played this central role. He dumped isolationism on the right, which was not so hard at the time, since many former isolationists were happy with an aggressive American foreign policy as long as the enemy was Soviet communism. More difficult was resolving the contradiction between anti-government libertarians and the traditionalists who believed in government's role as a promoter of virtue and community. One of National Review's primary tasks was dealing with this doctrinal conundrum, and Frank Meyer, Buckley's friend and magazine colleague, came up with what came to be known as fusionism, an attempt to fuse these two forms of conservatism into one. Libertarians needed to learn that the freedom they revered was insecure, absent the cultivation of personal virtue and a moral order hospitable to liberty. Traditionalists were not to confuse the legitimate authority of tradition with the illegitimate power of big government. The United States was fundamentally a conservative society, the theory went, so our country was a place in which liberty was conducive to a reverence for tradition. Fusionism, brilliant though it was, never fully cohered. Contemporary conservatism always threatens to fly apart, as it seems to be doing now. Conservatism's goals are a combustible mix: an expansive and expensive foreign policy, low taxes, support for government intervention in the personal sphere to promote a conservative vision of virtue, but not in the economic sphere. For some of us, the mix makes little sense, and I could go on, and I have gone on, about the many contradictions of contemporary conservatism. I do believe that conservatism is now in deep crisis, and there is evidence that Buckley himself experienced intimations that his beloved conservatism was in trouble. But that is for another evening or another day, but not this one. There is another paradox that might make a Catholic liberal like me smile. It's a paradox in Buckley's conservatism. He was a rebel. He was a dissident. He was even an advocate of a counterculture, though his counterculture involved harpsichords, not electric guitars or drums. Despite his differences with the left, Buckley actually had much in common with the young new leftists whom he would criticize so often. He rebelled no less than they did against the conformity of the 1950s. Buckley and his colleague Willie Schlam wrote in their prospectus for the National Review, middle of the road is politically, intellectually, and morally repugnant. That is something that, say, Daniel Berrigan might have said. Asked by Max Eastman to exercise discretion in the magazine, Buckley replied, "All I can say to satisfy you is that I want discretion in the sense that I want intelligence and no crackpottery, but I want some positively unsettling vigor, a sense of abandon and joy and cocksureness that may indeed be interpreted by some as indiscretion." Unsettling vigor, abandon, joy. Was Bill Buckley on the road to Max Yastra's farm at Woodstock? Buckley's radicalism could be be seen especially in his feelings about Dwight D. Eisenhower. No figure seemed to annoy Buckley quite so much as Ike, a sign of things to come, since moderate to liberal Republicans tended to trouble Buckley far more than liberal Democrats, who at least stayed in the party where they belonged. Eisenhower, Buckley wrote in Up From Liberalism, is the symbol of the modulated age, and modulated was not a nice word to him. Buckley went on, it has been the dominating ambition of Eisenhower's modern republicanism to govern in such a fashion as to more or less please more or less everybody. Such governments must shrink from principle, because principles have edges, principles cut, and blood is drawn, and people get hurt. And who would hurt anyone in an age of modulation? The struggle these days, if that is the word for it, is toward blandness, toward a national euphoria. Leadership, he said, consists in giving people everything they want. The Eisenhower program, Buckley went on, is an attitude which goes by the name of a program undirected by principle, unchained to any coherent idea as to the nature of man and society, uncommitted to any sustaining estimate of the nature or potential of the enemy. What a wonderful polemicist he was. I like Ike more than Buckley did, but who cannot love him for detesting blandness and, yes, for insisting on principle? I do want to focus very briefly, this is my one really polemical moment here, on what I think was Bill Buckley's largest mistake, a mistake he gradually corrected, because I do think it should give conservatives pause, not about Buckley the man at all, but about the conservative philosophy. Buckley's initial reaction to the civil rights movement, as many of you know, were rather hostile. In Up From Liberalism, Buckley declared flatly that yes, there are circumstances in which the minority can lay claim to preeminent political authority without bringing down on its head the moral opprobrium of just men. Buckley went on, in the South, the white community is entitled to put forward a claim to prevail politically because, for the time being anyway, the leaders of American civilization are white, as one would certainly expect given their preternatural advantages of tradition, training, and economic status. Buckley continued, a conservative feels sympathy for the Southern position, which the liberal applying his ideological abstractions ruthlessly cannot feel. If the majority wills what is socially atavistic, then to thwart the majority may be the indicated, though concededly undemocratic course. It is more important for the community, wherever situated geographically, to affirm and live by civilized standards than to labor at the job of swelling the voting list. Buckley suggested that if the South could strengthen its case if it applied voting qualification tests impartially to black and white, it could then be accused of being undemocratic but not racially discriminatory. And being undemocratic in Buckley's eyes at the time, this, by the way, the man who once said, and I agree with him, that I would rather be governed by the first 500 names in the Boston phone book than by the faculty of Harvard University. But at the time, this undemocratic view was by no means the worst sin. He's also said the democracy of universal suffrage is not a bad form of government. It is simply not necessarily nor inevitably a good form of government. Democracy must be justified by its works. Now, I am here tonight to praise Buckley, not to condemn him. And again, it's important to underscore that his views on these matters changed, as did the views of millions of Americans. But I would say to my conservative friends here that it is worth considering the source of Buckley's initial error, because I think his argument for segregation was actually impeccably conservative. Those of us who are progressive are not always sufficiently alive to the possible unintended consequences of our plans for reform and renewal. But I do believe that conservatives can be led badly astray by their suspicion of change, their tendency to endorse existing hierarchies, their skepticism of equality, and, as Buckley's quotation attests, their quest and often unspoken skepticism of a democracy of universal coverage. And I would argue that Christian and Catholic conservatives should be especially alive to this problem, hailing as they do, as we do,
from a tradition that promises that the first shall be last, that sees the poor inheriting the earth, and who follow a Savior whose first commandment was not about efficiency, not about hierarchy, not even about freedom, but as the reading at Vespers today points out, it was a commandment about love. But one of the many things that made Buckley great was his awareness that sinners exist in all philosophical realms, and that conservatives, no less than liberals, needed to be wary of their own certainties. Conservatives pride themselves on resisting change, which is as it should be, Buckley said, but intelligent deference to tradition and stability can evolve into intellectual sloth and moral fanaticism, as when conservatives simply decline to look up from dogma because the effort to raise their heads and reconsider is too great. No liberal could have said it better. And if conservatism is in trouble now, I think it is because its difficulties arise in large part from the failure of my friends on the right to heed this wise admonition from their muse and their patron saint. The title I was supposed to speak to tonight was The Catholic William F. Buckley in the Present Progressive Moment. I have consciously spoken to that title only indirectly, knowing that Buckley himself would advise each of us never to follow any orders we're given very closely. But I would like to suggest that those of us who would think of ourselves as Catholic and progressive, and we'd like to hope as patriots, might find common cause with the Bill Buckley, who was a Catholic and a conservative and a patriot. We can come together around our obligation to gratitude. In 1990, Buckley wrote a lovely little book called Gratitude, subtitled Reflections on What We Owe to Our Country. Buckley used the book to endorse the idea of national service. And he said that it was an idea that if it takes over the public imagination, as it has done my own, the cost will prove bearable and its fruits beyond the reach of slide rules. And then properly conceived, the status of the citizen in a republic, uniting privilege with responsibility, evolves into a kind of nobility no less aristocratic for being widespread and universally accessible. Is there any difficulty in conceiving a society where every one of its members is of an aristocratic order? Materialistic democracy beckons every man to make himself a king. Republican citizenship incites every man to be a knight. National service, like gravity, is something we could accustom ourselves to and grow to love. No Catholic liberal, or for that matter, no Catholic socialist could have said it better, though we might resist Buckley's metaphor as being unduly monarchist, another position with which he had no problem. But I'd like to close with the very first words of Buckley's book on gratitude, because they seem so appropriate in a school that grew out of the life of a monastery. Here's what Buckley wrote at the beginning of his book on gratitude. I have always thought Anatole France's story of the Juggler to be one of enduring moral resonance. This is the arresting and affecting tale of the young monk who aspires to express his devotion to the Virgin Mary, having dejectedly reviewed during his first week as a postulant at the monastery alongside Our Lady of Sorrows, the prodigies and gifts of his fellow monks. Oh, some sang like nightingales. Others played their musical instruments as virtuosi. Still others rhapsodized with the tongues of poets. But all this young novice had learned in the way of special skills before entering the monastery was to entertain modestly as a juggler. And so in the dead of night, driven by the mandate to serve, walking furtively lest he be seen and mocked by his brothers, he makes his ardent way to the altar with his sack full of wooden mallets and balls and does his act for Our Lady. This account of the struggle to express gratitude is unsurpassed in devotional literature, Buckley wrote. The apparent grotesquerie, honoring the Mother of the Savior of the universe, the vessel of salvation, with muscular gyrations designed to capture the momentary interest of 6-year-olds, is inexpressibly beautiful in the mind's eye. The act of propitiation, gratitude reified. I am very honored to have been asked to play a role at this conference, which is an expression of our gratitude for the life of William F. Buckley, Jr. Personally, I wish he had been less politically effective. I wish that he had paid a bit more attention to the progressive encyclicals of Pope John XXIII. I wish he had taken a bit more advice on social and economic matters from his friend Galbraith. But who in the end can escape loving this man who spent his own life as a juggler of words, of ideas, of friendships, of commitments, of adventures. God granted Bill Buckley life, and in doing so, he blessed the rest of us. And that is why we are here in witness to our gratitude. Thank you very much.
Sub in